Marijuana Prohibition, Part 2. Scott Pearce.
Millions of Americans love to smoke marijuana and get stoned. We've seen already that cannabis has been used as a medicine and as a sacrament for a very long time. Now let's look at the history of the marijuana drug culture in the West. Napoleon brought cannabis and hashish home to France after he waged war in Egypt. It comes as no surprise that certain avant-garde bohemian European artists took to these drugs within a few years of their introduction to the European scene. By late in the 1800s, the English and the Europeans both had circles of artists whose nonconformity included heavy alcohol and drug use. They tended to live tragic and short lives and were not seen as role models of good health. As we'll see in a few minutes, indigenous Mexicans grew and smoked cannabis, which they called marijuana. Their contact with white folks was central to the criminalization of the substance. In the first half of the 20th century, the other group of Americans that commonly smoked marijuana were black folks in the ghetto. It was, and some say still is, a common feature of the jazz scene in New Orleans and throughout the United States. Again, these circumstances proved useful to politicians who wanted to target and demonize minorities. In the second half of the 20th century, the group most often associated with marijuana is the white counterculture. It's important to remember that the movement against the Vietnam War united the civil rights movement with the drug subculture. As we'll see in a moment, that connection was not lost on the most reactionary elements of the political establishment in the U.S. at the end of the 1960s. They exploited it to great political advantage. How is it that such a useful, plentiful, and relatively harmless plant as marijuana would end up getting criminalized? To answer this question, we have to take a look at the temperance movement and prohibition. The history of prohibition is one of the most surprising parts of our story, and it takes us back to the middle of the 1800s. It's reasonable to observe that there were three great moral crusades in the USA between about 1850 and 1925, and all of them were linked and connected to one another. They were, number one, the abolitionist movement against slavery, number two, the women's suffrage movement, and number three, the temperance movement. All-out alcohol prohibition campaigns had been made in every state between 1850 and 1869. Susan B. Anthony established the Women's State Temperance Society of New York in 1852. Elizabeth Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Abby Kelly also were ardent prohibitionists. The temperance movement had another go at state-by-state prohibition between 1880 and 1890, but succeeded only in turning Maine, Kansas, and North Dakota into dry states. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Lessee v. Hardin in 1890 hurt the temperance movement by prohibiting a dry state from preventing a citizen from ordering and receiving alcoholic beverages from a wet state. Meanwhile, the U.S. Supreme Court recognized that the police power of states included the right to criminalize the sale and distribution of dangerous substances. The state was Tennessee. The products, surprisingly, were cigarettes and cigarette papers. The case was Austin v. Tennessee, and it was decided in 1890. The 18th Amendment, establishing prohibition, was passed by constitutional majorities of Congress on December 18, 1917, and was ratified by the 36th state in January 16, 1919. It became the law of the land on January 16, 1920. It's worth noting that the women's suffrage movement achieved its primary goal at about the same time. The 19th Amendment became part of the law in 1920, giving women the right to vote. So, with prohibition in the background, we turn now to look at government regulation of narcotics, primarily opiates and cocaine. At the end of the 19th century, most drug addicts in the USA got that way because of medical treatment, not because they wanted to get high. Many Northern Civil War veterans left the military addicted to morphine, and civilian surgery patients often were discharged from treatment addicted. Over-the-counter medications, so-called patent medicines, were unregulated, and many of them were morphine preparations. As a result, many people, particularly women, became drug addicts by accident. The Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in 1906. It's probably the most successful anti-drug abuse law ever passed, and it is not a criminal law. It merely required the labeling of over-the-counter medications. Finally, the Harrison Act of 1914 was a tax law. It saw the federal government get in the business of regulating the medical use of opiates and cocaine, and it required doctors to keep records and pay a tax. Those who violated the law were subject to criminal penalties. By 1921, tobacco cigarettes were illegal in 14 states. It's worth mentioning that both the Harrison Act and the 1937 marijuana law both were tax acts. It was thought that the federal government couldn't enact criminal laws because that was the province of the state governments. Most federal criminal laws on the books in this country today have been enacted since 1965. Now we're ready to turn our attention to the laws that establish the prohibition against marijuana. The context I've just provided suggests that there is nothing special about the early local efforts to prohibit the recreational use of cannabis. There was a war being waged against all intoxicants, and it had been going on for a long time before anybody noticed marijuana. Utah was the first state to enact anti-marijuana laws. In 1890, years after the Supreme Court banned polygamy in a case called Reynolds v. United States, the Mormon Church itself banned the practice as being contrary to the religion. Many Utah Mormons moved to northern Mexico rather than comply, but many of them were unhappy and came back to Utah. Thus, both returning Mormons and Mexican migrants introduced marijuana into Utah. The Mormon faith opposes the use of intoxicants of any kind, and marijuana was included when they passed their prohibition law in 1915. This was the first, and perhaps the most rational, of the state marijuana laws. The western states passed laws against marijuana subsequent to Utah, primarily, apparently, because of racism. 16 of the western states enacted anti-marijuana legislation before 1930. In Montana, the House Health Committee heard from Dr. Fred Fulcher, who said, quote, "When some beet-field peon takes this stuff, he thinks he has just been elected president of Mexico, so he starts to execute all his political enemies." Close quote. The Montana Standard newspaper described marijuana as, quote, "Mexican opium," close quote. So, if the western states' motivations appear to have been primarily racist, the eastern states that enacted anti-marijuana laws appear to have been concerned more about the substitution of marijuana for other intoxicants. Keep in mind that opium, morphine, and cocaine effectively had been criminalized by the Harrison Tax Act of 1914. Prohibition of alcohol was enacted as a constitutional amendment in 1919. Hearing about the sex and race-tinged horror stories from the West, Easterners were worried that ex-addicts and ex-drinkers would turn to this new drug and decided to prohibit it before it arrived. The New York Times of July 30, 1914 wrote, quote, "The inclusion of cannabis indica among the drugs to be sold on a prescription only is common sense. Devotees of hashish are now hardly numerous enough here to count, but they are likely to increase as other narcotics become harder to obtain."
This is a production of Nuclear Podcasting. Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives.